Hello, and welcome to your lecture on the Industrial Revolution. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. When you think about the luxuries of the modern era, luxuries which would have been unimaginable to people living 250 or 300 years ago, you might think about the internet, computers, cars, refrigerators, electricity, wastewater treatment plants that turn human sewage into heat for buildings and even drinking water. You might not think about how people nowadays have closets full of shoes and clothes which they did not sew themselves, from cloth they did not weave themselves, from thread they did not spin themselves, from wool they did not gather or prepare themselves. No wool, by the way. For a long time, cotton was a very expensive material to make clothes from because of the difficulty of removing all the tiny little seeds from the cotton bolls before you could use the fibers. Back before the Industrial Revolution that we'll be talking about today, there were no clothes factories. In fact, there weren't really any factories of any sort. If you wanted something, you had to either make it yourself or purchase it from someone who could make it. That means not just your clothes or shoes, but also your furniture, your dishes, your farming implements, your guns. They all had to be made either by you or by a professional, which meant that items were both time-consuming to make and expensive to purchase. If you were living on any kind of budget, you bought the bare minimum necessary to keep your home or business running. Then, along came the Industrial Revolution, and everything changed. The Industrial Revolution was the period of time from about 1700 to about 1840 when industrialization rapidly spread across Europe, particularly Britain, and the United States. By industrialization, I mean the shift from small-scale manufacturing processes, one or two people making an item, to large-scale manufacturing processes where you have a lot of people all making the same item. Industrialization tends to prize cost and efficiency over craftsmanship. So in other words, with industrialization, it is more important that an item be made cheaply and quickly than it is that that item be made beautifully and well. One of the hallmarks of industrialization is people and machines working together to produce goods. So instead of having one person spinning thread and weaving cloth at home, you have dozens of people and machines working together to weave cloth in factories. Now, because part of the point of industrialization is to produce goods more cheaply and efficiently. During the Industrial Revolution, people were constantly innovating to create new machines that would make work easier, faster, and cheaper. Many of our modern inventions actually have their roots in the Industrial Revolution. For example, the cotton gin, which was invented in 1794, is still in use today, albeit in a much more modern form. The effects of the Industrial Revolution upon the modern lifestyle go even beyond the inventions, however. Urbanization, which is the process of a population moving from the countryside to the city, really took off during the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people were farmers. They lived in the countryside. To give you some statistics, in the 1700s, 80% of Americans were farmers, and 94% of them in 1800 lived in rural areas. Compare that to today, when fewer than 2% of Americans are farmers, and only 17% of them live in rural areas. That shift, that very striking shift, began during the Industrial Revolution because before modern farming methods and machines made farming difficult rather than backbreaking, life in the countryside was grueling. And so when factories in the cities who needed workers to operate the machines started calling people to come from the countryside, come work in the factory, make a better life for you and your family, people heeded the call. and they fled the countryside in swarms and began living in cities. Urban areas became larger and larger, and more people gave up farming for working in factories or other city jobs. Your opinion of the countryside and the city will probably affect how you think about urbanization. However, there were effects of the Industrial Revolution which were undeniably positive. One of them was that goods became more accessible and affordable. And that's what you would expect, right? You have all these factories producing goods more cheaply and efficiently. Of course, they're going to cost less to buy, and there's going to be more of them to buy. In addition, food became more plentiful thanks to inventions which revolutionized farming, and travel became easier due to inventions like the steamboat and the train, which made it so much more efficient to travel from one part of the country to the other. A third effect of the Industrial Revolution, which you might not think about at first, was increased social and economic mobility. Mobility means moving, and social mobility refers to how easy it is to move from a lower social class to a higher social class. Economic mobility refers to how easy it is to move from poverty to wealth. So in other words, if you have an area where if you are born poor, you will die poor thanks to laws or other social conditions, no matter how hard you work or how good you are at your job, that area is going to have very low economic mobility. But on the other hand, if you're born poor, but through hard work and success, opportunities, maybe a little bit of luck, you're able to gain wealth, that means that there is high economic mobility. Now, economic mobility doesn't mean that everyone who starts off poor will end up rich. It just means that the opportunity is there. It's possible, where it is not possible in an area with low economic mobility. The Industrial Revolution increased social and economic mobility substantially because of all the opportunities it created. If you have an idea for an invention and you're able to patent it and sell it, you can make millions on it. If you begin as a factory worker, maybe you work hard, maybe you're really great at doing your factory work, you're able to become a manager, and then maybe you own the factory, and then maybe you create more factories, and all of a sudden you're a millionaire. The effects on social and economic mobility that occurred during the Industrial Revolution are still present in our society. If you're able to work hard and save well and have great new ideas and take advantage of opportunities, you can still improve your life in this country and other countries that had industrial revolutions. And that is an opportunity and a situation which has not been present for much of human history. We really do live in a fantastic age, and a lot of that is thanks to the increased social mobility that began to occur during the Industrial Revolution. Not all the effects of the Industrial Revolution were positive, however. Life in the countryside might have been grueling, at least it was outside. Conditions in Industrial Revolution factories were brutal. People worked 12 to 18-hour days for low pay in horribly unsafe working conditions. There were thousands of factory accidents every year, accidents which often permanently maimed or even killed the worker. And children were not exempt from these dangerous conditions. Many children worked upwards of 10 hours a day in factories. Factories liked employing kids. They were cheap. You could pay them way less than an adult. And children were agile. They were small. They could slip under and around large moving machinery in order to clear debris or stop snags. You might wonder why parents would let their children work in factories under these conditions. And the answer is first, that in that day and age, children weren't expected to help contribute to the family. On farms, kids worked from a very young age. But in addition to that, for families who are living on the edge, a child's income might determine whether that family was able to put food on the table or keep a roof over their head. The working conditions in the Industrial Revolution were not the only negative effect. The other one was that with the rapid rise of industry, much of which was based on burning coal, you also have horrible pollution and environmental damage. In addition to coal burning, which released all these particulates into the air, you also have companies dumping toxic chemicals into waterways. And generally, the effects were pretty bad, both for humans and the environment. An example of this would be in London, England, where the smoke that was released from all these coal-burning factories and homes would mingle with the fog, and it would create these dense black hazes that were so dark that walking around during the daytime, it was as dark as it would have been at night. You can imagine that this was very bad for people's lungs. And over the course of the 19th century, you see increasing cases of fatal bronchitis, so that by the height of the smoke in 1890, 1 in 350 people ended up dying of bronchitis caused by the smoke in the air. But enough about death and pollution. I've talked so far about some of the ways in which the Industrial Revolution changed people's lives. Now I'd like to talk about 2 Industrial Revolution inventions that changed the entire United States. The first is the steam engine. Invented by Scottishman James Watt in 1769, the steam engine used the pressure from built-up steam to power machines. And as you can imagine, putting steam engines into trains and boats, which heretofore had been powered by horsepower or by manpower, revolutionized transportation. First up were the steamboats in 1807. Steamboats were much faster than normal boats, and they could travel upriver. Can you imagine how amazing that would be for transporting passengers and goods? Unfortunately, steamboats had a fatal flaw. They sometimes blew up. This is because think about how a steam engine works. You have this blazing fire, which you have to constantly feed with coal and stoke. And that fire heats up water inside a boiler. The water turns into steam and creates pressure, which propels the vehicle forward. However, you have to have a pressure release valve on the boiler. Think of it like a balloon. If you fill it with air, fill, 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 fill. If you fill it too far, pop. With a boiler, if that pressure from the steam gets too much, kaboom, and everyone dies. Now, steamboats did have pressure release valves for their boilers, but sometimes they didn't function properly, or sometimes they weren't managed properly, and then you would have an explosion, which was often fatal. Steamboats, in fact, were notorious for blowing up, but they were so superior in every other way to other boats that they nonetheless became popular. For that speed, the risk was worth it. Trains, which were invented in 1828, were even more impressive than steamboats. They could move at 30 miles an hour, 4 times as fast as a horse. The boilers did blow up sometimes on trains as well, although they generally killed the train crew rather than the passengers. Regardless, trains were a wild success, and railroads soon connected the country. In fact, by 1860, a mere 32 years after the invention of the train, there were more than 30,000 miles of track in the United States, enabling goods and passengers to travel all over the country. I should mention, though, that the northern United States had more than twice as much track as the southern United States, which would give it a distinct advantage in the American Civil War. Before we go on to the next invention, I want to talk to you about trains in their infancy, because of course they couldn't always go at 30 miles an hour. In fact, in the early days, back in the 1829, 1830, they could only go 18 miles an hour. And this man with the marvelous facial hair is an inventor named Peter Cooper, who also, by the way, invented Jell-O. And in 1830, he created the cutest train ever. It was called the Tom Thumb, and it could move at a whopping 18 miles an hour. And on the first ride, when he invited these gentlemen to come onto the Tom Thumb, they were so amazed at the speed that they wrote their names on pieces of paper to show that it was possible at such high speeds. This kind of delight in invention, in the possibilities of invention, was very characteristic of the Industrial Revolution. It was definitely shared by our next inventor, Eli Whitney, who in 1794 invented the cotton gin. Remember how I said that before the Industrial Revolution, cotton clothes were really expensive because in order to get usable fibers from the cotton wool, you had to manually pick out all the seeds, and it was time consuming and a pain in the neck? Well, Eli Whitney's cotton gin fixed that problem. It could comb out seeds from cotton 50 times more efficiently than they could be picked out by hand. And as a result, cotton clothes became widespread and affordable. In fact, I'm wearing cotton right now. The cotton gin had another effect. It kept the South primarily agricultural, which means farm-based. In other words, the rapid urbanization, moving from countryside to city, farms to factories, that was occurring in the North did not happen in the South. Many people in the South continued to be farmers, continued to live in rural areas. This is because all those northern textile mills that were making cloth needed lots and lots of cotton to make that cloth. And large southern plantations using the cotton gin could produce that cotton to sell to those northern factories. The South was wildly successful at producing cotton. By 1850, the South was producing 3/4 of the world's cotton. Unfortunately, the cotton gin had another unintended consequence, and that was that it ended up entrenching slavery in the United States. When the northern factories wanted cheap labor, they had a ready source of it in the immigrants that would come over. But the South didn't have immigrants like that, and the southern plantation owners wanted a cheap source of labor to work the plantations and gather the cotton. And so they turned to slaves. And that is why, instead of slavery dying out, as it otherwise might have done in the South, it instead becomes so entrenched that many Southerners begin to think of slavery as being necessary to their economy and to their way of life. The Industrial Revolution was a time of great progress and innovation for Europe and for the United States, all of it. But as the 19th century progresses, we begin to see more and more of a difference between the northern and the southern half of the United States. The North is urbanized, depends on factories, and an anti-slavery sentiment, which has always been part of our nation's thought processes, is beginning to really take a foothold. Meanwhile, the South is remaining primarily agricultural, farm-based, producing cotton, and beginning to see slavery as essential to its way of life. Tensions inevitably rise, and next week we'll look at those rising tensions, both economic and philosophical, which divide further and further the North and South, and eventually erupt in civil war. See you next week.